Alrighty, so part 4 of Unit 2. Part 1, we looked at political extremisms. Part 2, we looked at the rise of industrialism and entrepreneurs. Part 3, we looked at labor. Part 4, we're back at the beginning. We're going to talk about politics. So just as a reminder, we're looking at a time frame from roughly the beginning of 1877 through around 1892, somewhere in that vicinity. We'll go a little bit past that probably. So, first of all, the return of the bearded weirdos. Bearded weirdo number 1. There he is, the man, the myth, the legend, Rutherford Bertrand Hayes. So, Hayes won the election of 1876 because of a very sketchy backroom political deal referred to as the Compromise of 1877. Even going into it, he announced he was only going to serve one term, which was probably safe for him because the Republicans really didn't have any plans for him running for a second term. Given how it was he was elected, and given a little bit of what we're going to talk about, he really had no chance of doing anything, which is sad because probably had given a fair opportunity, he would have made a decent president. He was not a bad guy. He had a lot of good ideas and was fairly adept at recognizing how to make things work and run properly. But I digress. So let's talk about his one brief term in office. Probably the biggest success, and the thing that I want you to take away from most of all from this is he really ended the corruption of Ulysses S. Grant's administration. It isn't just that with Grant going away, the corruption disappeared. The corruption was sort of built in to the administration. So what Hayes did was he basically came in and fired everybody in the executive branch. And I'm not just talking about like cabinet members, okay, because those get changed by administration. He literally removed all of the people in jobs and just wiped everything clean. Now, this really got the Republicans angry with him. Remember, the Republican Party had secretly arranged to get Hayes the White House, and they really expected that they were going to get something out of this. It had been a tradition in politics since the presidency of Andrew Jackson 50 years earlier in the 1820s that political offices were used as gifts to give people. Government jobs became rewards for people who like did favors for you. Republicans elected Hayes. They helped him get the White House. They expected to get executive jobs. That's not what Hayes did. Instead, Hayes went for an idea that is called meritocracy. Okay, and let me outline this here for you. Meritocracy. Meritocracy is the idea that you don't get a job unless you actually are qualified and you deserve the job. Hayes had no problem giving people jobs. He simply wanted them to take a test and prove that they were qualified to do the jobs. It seems kind of like a stupid thing. I mean, obviously, you should be qualified to do your job. But that's really not how people looked at it. This was a big success, though, at least for the executive branch. Hayes got it so that you had to be actually qualified to take a test and pass it to get a job. Now, a problematic area for Rutherford B. Hayes was his personal life. He was what is referred to as a teetotaler. That meant that he did not drink alcohol. Now, Hayes himself had no real problems with alcohol. He just personally didn't drink. He was okay with people who did. Occasionally, he'd have one or two. That was absolutely fine. He wasn't a big issue. The problem is Hayes's wife, Lucy. Lucy Hayes is a member of a group known as the Women's Temperance Movement. They are a growing political / social movement in America. And they are primarily made up of women, hence the term women, who are evangelical Protestant Christians. Those are the kind of Christians who eventually gave birth to people like the Pilgrims. And what they believed was that alcohol was not just bad, but it literally was the devil in a bottle. It was evil, period. Alcohol was the reason that there were problems. The women's temperance movement pushed that alcohol should not be available because it did bad things. It made men into basically animals who were cruel and who beat women and children and who didn't do things for their family and who were unproductive and lazy. A lot of the same sort of like things that Samuel Gompers had talked about in his speech, remember? The real significance of this is it shows the growing power and influence of a specific group of women in America. And this gets to the point where 50 years down the road, this group of women get what they were really after. The United States officially abolishes alcohol for the better part of 15 years. It was a horrible mistake, by the way, but we'll talk more about that later. The teetotaler aspect was problematic, though, because it really didn't sit well with a lot of government people that Lucy Hayes was such a hardcore anti-alcohol person. And by the way, this word temperance means moderation, particularly being like moderate or like removing alcohol. Now, if there is one area that is an absolute failure for the Hayes administration, it's the issue of civil rights. Hayes's decision to let the southern states run themselves meant that the southern states would not give rights to African Americans. Under normal circumstance, the federal government would have intervened, but Hayes chose not to because he was hoping that his laissez-faire, to borrow an economic term we learned earlier, his hands-off attitude towards how the states ran themselves would really push these southern states to vote Republican. They didn't. The Ku Klux Klan was far too powerful. So by not pushing civil rights, Hayes didn't win back white Southerners. He just made the Klan more powerful and at the expense of African Americans in the South. Now, let's look briefly here at money. If you remember, Hayes favored the gold standard, the idea that the government would only use gold to support its currency and its economy. Hayes cut back the amount of silver that the government actually purchased and distributed. The problem that Hayes really ran into was the issue of the greenbacks, those worthless paper monies that were printed during the Civil War and that were still in circulation. They had no gold to back them up. Now, if you recall, we talked about this last chapter or last unit. The Greenback Party was a group that wanted silver to be used as well as gold, and they would use the silver and the gold to back up the greenbacks as well as regular paper money. Hayes didn't want to do that, and he wanted to get rid of the greenbacks. So what he did is a rather controversial decision referred to as the buyback compromise. For a brief period of time, the government would actually give people real money, like real American money, in exchange for the greenbacks. So the best way to understand this would be like if the government said, for the next 2 weeks, you can go into any bank and exchange monopoly money for real U.S. money. That's kind of what they did here. Yes, it caused inflation to go up. Yes, it was problematic. Yeah, they wiped out the greenbacks afterwards and burned them up, but it really did get the goal accomplished of bringing greenbacks out of circulation. Now, this last part here, Hayes was very pro-business. That means he favored business and he was supportive of business. And remember, he's the guy who sent the army in to put down the B&O railroad strike. Really, what I need you to take out of this is, despite the fact that Hayes shut the strike down, he was actually really sympathetic with the strikers. He realized that the huge influx of immigrants into America in the 1870s, 60s, and 70s had resulted in more people looking for jobs and there were jobs available. Companies began using immigrants as a way to leverage wage cuts. If an employee didn't want to cut his wages by 25%, the employer would fire the worker and replace him with an immigrant who would work for half the cost. Hayes was sympathetic to that. He realized that that's just being jerky. Similarly, Hayes recognized that there was a problem because of the railroad overexpansion. Railroads had overexpanded. Railroads were now faced with a lot of competition. That meant that their profits went down. But ultimately, they overexpanded because the government paid them to overexpand. That wasn't labor's fault. But these things, despite how much Hayes agreed with workers, he didn't agree with the idea that when you're unhappy, you just riot and burn Pittsburgh. That's why he had to send the army in. Ultimately, Hayes's reaction to the B&O Railroad strike really did push workers into unions, and unions grew as a result of this during Hayes's brief period of presidency from 77 to 81. Now, Hayes was not running for re-election. The Republicans bring up former Civil War General James Garfield. Not to be outdone, the Democrats get their own former Civil War general, hero of Gettysburg, Winfield Scott Hancock. Both men very similar. The campaigns were virtually identical. Garfield won the election by less than 2,000 total votes. He may have been a decent president, but the thing is, he was only got to be president for 6 months. During his brief 6 months, he reasserted presidential power. What do I mean by that? Remember, Ulysses S. Grant believed that because the Constitution only gave him like 5 things he could do, he only literally could do like 5 things. Garfield's like, no, I'm the president. I can do like 50 things. Krupp's big guns were on everybody's mind. Garfield begins the process of fixing and updating the U.S. Navy, modernizing it. Garfield was a big believer in the removal of trade barriers. Let's pull down taxes and tariffs. Let's get everybody trading with each other because in the long run, it's going to benefit everybody, but especially us. And last but not least, seeing the failure of Hayes's attempts to woo Southern Democrats into the Republican Party, Garfield's just like, nope, we're going back to reinforcing civil rights. All of this was probably a good foreshadowing of a strong presidency. Unfortunately, a scant 6 months after his inauguration, while waiting for a train, a dude named Charles Guiteau walked up and shot James Garfield because Guiteau wanted a job and Garfield didn't give him one. By the way, I don't think Garfield even knew who the heck this guy was. It was just like, you didn't give me a job, die. He pulls out a gun and shoots him. Now, 2 ironies about this. Number one, Garfield's personal bodyguard was the son of Abraham Lincoln. That dude's just voodoo, man. Irony number 2, Garfield actually did not die from the gunshot wounds. He died from an infection. He contracted, I believe, gangrene at the hospital he went to because the doctors didn't bother to clean their hands or clean the surgical instruments, thus ending the poor life of James Garfield. And just as a little FYI here, James Garfield actually was the inspiration for everybody's favorite overweight house cat, Garfield the cat. So you can see here how he progressed over time. Jim Davis, the creator of Garfield, his family is related to James Garfield, and they had a tradition that somebody in the family would be named Garfield. So Jim passed along the name to the cartoon cat. So I really don't know what the heck this was in 1978. That's just hideous. And 1992 looks like Garfield became an emo for a while. But there you have it. Okay, that's it for this one. We'll pick it up on Monday with the presidency of Chester. I have big cheeks, Arthur. Peace and love.